The winter of 2023 brought more than snow to the crumbling Victorian mansion on Maple Street. When Sarah Mitchell received the final foreclosure notice, she expected to lose the last remnant of her late husband's family legacy. What she didn't expect was to discover a hidden room behind the library wall, or the brittle parchment letters inside that would bring the President of the United States to her doorstep within 72 hours. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this tale of hidden history captivates you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we have an even more extraordinary story waiting for you. Sarah Mitchell stood in the grand foyer of the three-story Victorian home that had sheltered 4 generations of the Mitchell family, watching the morning sun filter through the stained glass transom above the heavy oak front door. The colored light cast rainbow patterns across the worn Persian rug, the same rug where her husband David had taught their daughter Katie to take her first steps 25 years ago. Now Katie lived in Seattle with her own family, and David had been gone for 3 years, claimed by the same cancer that had slowly drained their savings and left Sarah drowning in medical debt. The foreclosure notice trembled in her weathered hands as she read it for the dozenth time since yesterday's. Mail delivery, 30 days. After 30 days, the house that David's great-great-grandfather had built in 1887 would belong to Metropolitan Trust Bank. Sarah pressed her fingers to her temples, fighting the headache that had become her constant companion since David's death. At 62, she felt ancient, worn down by grief and financial worry, until she barely recognized the confident Army logistics officer she had once been. The irony wasn't lost on her that after serving her country for 22 years, managing supply chains that kept troops fed and equipped across 3 continents, she couldn't manage to keep her own home. Her military pension covered basic living expenses, but the medical bills from David's final battle with lymphoma had consumed everything else. The life insurance policy they thought would provide security had been cashed out during his treatment, spent on experimental therapies that promised hope but delivered only more debt. Sarah walked slowly through the house, her footsteps echoing in rooms that had once been filled with laughter and conversation. The dining room where David's grandmother had hosted elaborate Sunday dinners for the entire extended family now stood empty, except for a single card table and 2 folding chairs. The formal living room, once showcasing antique furniture passed down through generations, contained only a worn recliner and a small television on a particle board stand. Everything of value had been sold over the past year, piece by piece, as bills mounted and resources dwindled. She paused at the entrance to David's study, the one room she hadn't been able to bring herself to clear out completely. His desk, still, held neat stacks of genealogy research, a hobby that had consumed his retirement years before illness intervened. David had been obsessed with tracing the Mitchell family history, spending hours poring over courthouse records, cemetery databases, and dusty archive boxes. He'd claimed the family had connections to important historical events, but Sarah had always assumed it was the wishful thinking of a man looking for meaning in his ordinary life. The morning news droned from the small television in the kitchen as Sarah made coffee with grounds she'd stretched for 3 days. The lead story was yet another political scandal involving classified documents found in unexpected places, prompting investigations and congressional hearings. Sarah half listened while opening the day's mail, mostly bills she couldn't pay and donation requests from organizations that somehow still had her name on their mailing lists, despite her financial circumstances. A knock at the front door interrupted her morning ritual. Through the peephole, she saw a young woman in a navy business suit, clipboard in hand, looking official and impatient. Sarah's heart sank. Another representative from the bank, probably here to assess the property for auction. Mrs. Mitchell? The woman's voice was crisp and professional. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from Metropolitan Trust. I'm here to conduct the pre-foreclosure property assessment. I understand this is difficult, but it's a required step in the process." Sarah opened the door reluctantly, gesturing the woman inside. "I suppose you need to measure rooms and take photographs for the listing." Jennifer nodded sympathetically while pulling out a digital camera and measuring tape. "The bank wants to ensure accurate property valuations. I'll try to be as unobtrusive as possible. How long have you lived here?" 43 years, Sarah replied, watching Jennifer photograph the foyer's architectural details. "My husband's family built this house in 1887. We raised our daughter here, celebrated every holiday here. It's been the center of our family's life for over a century." Jennifer paused in her documentation, studying Sarah's face with what might have been genuine empathy. "I'm sorry you're going through this. I see these situations every day, and it never gets easier. The bank isn't heartless, but they have obligations to their shareholders." As Jennifer moved through the house, efficiently cataloguing everything from crown molding to hardwood floor conditions, Sarah found herself sharing memories she hadn't spoken aloud since David's death. The story of how David's great-great-grandfather had been a carpentry foreman who'd saved enough money to buy this plot of land and build his dream house. How the family had weathered the Great Depression by taking in boarders. How David's grandfather had hidden the family's silverware in the walls during World War II, convinced that invasion was imminent. Hidden in the walls? Jennifer looked up from her notes with interest. "That's fascinating. Did they ever find all of it?" Sarah shrugged. "David used to joke that the house probably still had secrets we hadn't discovered. He was always tapping on walls and checking for hollow spaces, convinced his ancestors had hidden more than just silverware. I thought it was just wishful thinking." Jennifer continued her assessment, spending considerable time in David's study, examining the built-in bookshelves and original architectural features. She ran her hands along the wood paneling, checking for damage or irregularities that might affect the property's value. At one point, she pressed against a section of the wall behind the largest bookshelf and frowned. "Mrs. Mitchell, has this wall ever been repaired or modified? There's something unusual about the construction here." Sarah joined Jennifer behind the bookshelf, an area she rarely visited, because it was difficult to access and collect dust. Jennifer was right. The wood paneling in this section looked different from the rest of the room, newer somehow, despite the house's age. "David did some work back here years ago," Sarah recalled slowly. "He said he was reinforcing the foundation, but I never paid much attention. He was always tinkering with something in this house." Jennifer knocked on the wall experimentally, and the sound was distinctly hollow compared to the solid thud from other sections. "Mrs. Mitchell, I think your husband might have been right about the house having secrets. This sounds like there might be a void behind this panel." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. David had spent countless hours in this study during his final years, researching family history with an intensity that had sometimes worried her. She'd assumed it was just a way to stay busy while fighting his illness. But what if he'd actually Discovered something? How would we find out for sure? Sarah asked, running her own hands along the suspicious paneling. Jennifer glanced at her clipboard, then back at the wall. Well, this is outside my normal duties, but if there's a hidden space, it could affect the property valuation. The bank would want to know about any unusual features or structural modifications. She paused thoughtfully. Do you have any tools? Maybe we could remove a small section of paneling to see what's behind it. Sarah retrieved David's toolbox from the basement, a heavy metal case filled with implements he'd accumulated during 40 years of home maintenance and hobby projects. Jennifer selected a thin pry bar and carefully worked it along the edge of the suspicious panel. The wood creaked and protested, but slowly began to separate from the wall behind it. There's definitely a space back here, Jennifer said, breathing heavily from the effort. The panel is attached with modern screws, not original construction. Someone intentionally created this opening. With Sarah's help, they managed to remove a 3-foot section of paneling, revealing a narrow cavity between the wall studs. The space was perhaps 8 inches deep and extended both up and down beyond their line of sight. Jennifer shined her phone's flashlight into the opening, illuminating dust motes and spider webs, but also something else. There's something wrapped in cloth up there. Jennifer pointed to a bundle wedged into the upper portion of the cavity. Can you reach it? Sarah stretched her arm into the opening, her fingers just barely touching the mysterious package. It felt like fabric wrapped around something hard and rectangular. After several attempts, she managed to work it loose and pull it through the opening. The bundle was wrapped in what appeared to be oilcloth, tied with string that had probably once been white, but had yellowed with age. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she untied the string and carefully peeled back the protective wrapping. Inside were what appeared to be old documents, yellowed paper covered with faded ink in an elegant handwriting style she didn't recognize. Jennifer leaned closer as Sarah carefully lifted the top document. The paper was brittle and seemed almost transparent with age, but the writing was still legible. At the top of the page, in flowing script, were the words, "My dear Hamilton," and at the bottom, a signature that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. "Is that what I think it is?" Jennifer whispered, staring at the signature. Sarah's military training had included enough American history to recognize the distinctive handwriting she was looking at. The signature read, G. Washington, in the unmistakable style of the first. President of the United States. "This can't be real," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "This can't actually be a letter from George Washington." But as they carefully examined the other documents in the bundle, each one appeared to be genuine correspondence between George Washington and various other historical figures, including Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin. The letters discussed everything from military strategy during the Revolutionary War to the early challenges of forming a new government. Jennifer pulled out her phone and began taking photographs of the documents. "Mrs. Mitchell, if these are authentic, they could be worth—" She paused, trying to calculate. "I don't even know how to estimate the value. Original George Washington letters have sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars at auction. A collection like this could be worth millions." Sarah stared at the letters spread across David's desk, trying to process what she was seeing. Her husband had somehow discovered or inherited a collection of original correspondence from the founding fathers of America, hidden in the walls of their family home for who knew how long. The financial implications were staggering, but even more than that, these documents represented a piece of American history that scholars had presumably never seen. "We need to call someone," Jennifer said urgently. "These documents need to be authenticated by experts, but more importantly, they need to be preserved and protected. If they're real, they're national treasures." Sarah's mind raced as she considered the implications. If the letters were authentic, they would solve all her financial problems and then some. She could save the house, pay off David's medical debts, and live comfortably for the rest of her life. But she also understood that documents of this historical significance belonged to more than just one person. They were part of America's heritage. "Who do we call?" Sarah asked, still staring at George Washington's distinctive signature. "The Smithsonian? The National Archives? I don't even know where to begin." Jennifer was already scrolling through her phone contacts. "I think we start with the police, actually. Documents of this potential value need to be reported and protected immediately. Then we contact historical experts who can guide us through the proper authentication process." As Jennifer made her first phone call, Sarah continued examining the letters, trying to understand how they had ended up hidden in her family's home. David's genealogy research suddenly took on new significance. Had he known about these documents? Had his family been guardians of this historical treasure for generations, waiting for the right moment to reveal it to the world? The morning that had started with foreclosure notices and financial despair had suddenly transformed into something Sarah couldn't have imagined in her wildest dreams. Hidden behind the walls of the house she was about to lose, her husband's family had preserved a collection of documents that could rewrite textbooks and change her life forever. But Sarah's military experience had taught her that when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. As she waited for Jennifer to finish her phone calls, she couldn't shake the feeling that discovering these letters was just the beginning of a much larger and more complicated story. Within an hour of Jennifer's phone calls, Sarah's quiet Victorian home had transformed into a hub of activity that would have impressed her old Army logistics unit. Detective Robert Hayes arrived first, a methodical man in his 50s who treated the discovery with the serious attention of someone who understood that historical documents could be as valuable as stolen artwork. He was followed by Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the University of Chicago's History Department, who had driven 3 hours after Jennifer's frantic call to her professor contact. Dr. Rodriguez entered David's study with the reverence of someone approaching a sacred site. She wore white cotton gloves and carried a briefcase filled with magnifying equipment, digital cameras, and what appeared to be scientific instruments Sarah couldn't identify. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her wire-rimmed glasses reflected the afternoon light streaming through the study's tall windows. "Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to understand that what you may have discovered here could be one of the most significant historical finds in decades," Dr. Rodriguez said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "But we need to proceed very carefully. Authentication of documents, this old and potentially valuable, requires extensive testing and analysis." Sarah watched as the historian carefully photographed each letter from multiple angles, documenting everything from the paper texture to the ink patterns. Detective Hayes maintained a respectful distance, but kept detailed notes about the discovery process, chain of custody, and everyone who had access to the documents. The handwriting appears consistent with authenticated Washington correspondence, Dr. Rodriguez murmured, studying the letters through her magnifying glass. The paper stock looks appropriate for the period, and the ink has aged in ways that would be difficult to fake convincingly. But I'm not the final authority on authentication. We'll need specialists from the National Archives and possibly the FBI's art crime team. Jennifer had remained throughout the afternoon, her initial property assessment forgotten in the face of this extraordinary discovery. She sat in the corner of the study, fielding phone calls from her supervisor at Metropolitan Trust, trying to explain why a routine foreclosure inspection had uncovered what might be national treasures. The bank is very interested in how this affects the property situation, Jennifer explained to Sarah during a quiet moment. If these documents prove authentic and valuable, it obviously changes everything about your financial circumstances. Sarah nodded absently, still struggling to process the morning's events. She kept thinking about David, wondering if he had known about the letters during his final years. His genealogy research had always seemed obsessive to her, but perhaps he had been following clues that led him to this hidden cache. She remembered him spending hours in this very room, tapping on walls and measuring spaces, claiming he was looking for structural issues. Dr. Rodriguez's examination revealed additional details that increased her excitement. Several of the letters contained references to historical events that weren't well documented in existing archives. One correspondence between Washington and Hamilton discussed military strategies that historians had only theorized about. Another letter from Benjamin Franklin described scientific experiments that weren't mentioned in his published papers. Mrs. Mitchell, if these prove authentic, they don't just have monetary value, Dr. Rodriguez explained, carefully placing each letter in protective archival sleeves. They could provide new insights into how our founding fathers thought and operated during the most crucial period in American history. Some of the information here could change how we understand the Revolutionary War and the early formation of our government. Detective Hayes received a call that prompted him to step outside for privacy. When he returned, his expression was more serious than before. Mrs. Mitchell, I've been in contact with federal authorities. Given the potential historical and monetary significance of this discovery, the FBI wants to get involved. They have specialists who deal with art and antiquities crimes, and they want to ensure proper handling and authentication. Sarah felt a chill of concern. Am I in some kind of trouble? I didn't know these letters existed until this morning. Not at all, Hayes assured her. But documents of this potential value need federal oversight to prevent theft, forgery, or illegal sale. The FBI will help coordinate with legitimate historical institutions to ensure proper authentication and preservation. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself thinking more about David's family history research. She retrieved his genealogy, files from the desk drawers, spreading charts and photocopied documents across the dining room table. David had traced the Mitchell family lineage back to the Revolutionary War period, but she had never paid close attention to the specific details. Now, studying his meticulously organized research with new interest, Sarah began to see patterns that had escaped her notice before. David's ancestor, Jonas Mitchell, had served as a courier and messenger during the Revolutionary War. According to family records, Jonas had been trusted with sensitive communications between military commanders and political leaders. Jennifer joined Sarah at the dining room table, studying the genealogy charts with fresh perspective. Look at this. She pointed to a section of David's research. Your husband documented that Jonas Mitchell was specifically assigned to carry messages between George Washington's headquarters and various Continental Congress members. That would explain how original letters ended up in your family's possession. Sarah traced the family timeline with her finger, seeing her husband's research in an entirely new light. David always said the family had been involved in important historical events, but I thought he was just romanticizing ordinary people's lives. I never imagined he might have been literally correct. Dr. Rodriguez overheard their conversation and joined them at the table. It's not uncommon for important historical documents to remain in private family collections for generations. Sometimes families didn't realize the significance of what they possessed, or they deliberately kept documents hidden for security reasons. During and after the Revolutionary War, many people were afraid that possessing certain political documents could be dangerous. The historian studied David's family charts with professional interest. If Jonas Mitchell was indeed a trusted courier, he might have been given these letters for safekeeping during a particularly dangerous period. Or he might have saved them from destruction when Washington's headquarters were threatened by British forces. Detective Hayes received another phone call that prompted a lengthy conversation outside. When he returned, he was accompanied by two additional people: Agent Maria Santos from the FBI's art crime team and Dr. William Chen from the Smithsonian Institution's archives. Agent Santos was a compact woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority, while Dr. Chen appeared to be in his 70s with the patient demeanor of someone who had spent decades working with historical documents. "Mrs. Mitchell," Agent Santos said, introducing herself with a firm handshake, "I understand you've made a remarkable discovery. Dr. Chen and I are here to help ensure these documents are properly protected and authenticated. This is exactly the kind of situation where federal coordination is essential." Dr. Chen approached the letters with the same reverence Dr. Rodriguez had shown, but with additional equipment that looked more sophisticated than anything Sarah had seen before. He explained that initial authentication would involve multiple types of analysis: paper composition, ink chemistry, handwriting verification, and historical context validation. "The good news, Mrs. Mitchell, is that if these documents prove authentic, federal law protects your ownership rights as long as they were legally acquired by your family," Dr. Chen explained while setting up his equipment. "The government's interest is in ensuring proper preservation and preventing illegal trafficking, not in confiscating legitimate family heirlooms." Agent Santos added practical details about the next steps in the process. "We'll need to transport the documents to specialized facilities for comprehensive testing. This could take several weeks or even months to complete properly. In the meantime, we'll document everything thoroughly and ensure you have legal representation to protect your interests." Sarah realized she was completely unprepared for the legal and financial complexities that would follow if the letters proved authentic. "I don't have money for lawyers or experts," she admitted. "I was facing foreclosure this morning because I can't even afford my basic bills." Jennifer spoke up unexpectedly. "Mrs. Mitchell, I spoke with my supervisor again, and Metropolitan Trust is prepared to suspend foreclosure proceedings pending resolution of this situation. The bank understands that these circumstances are completely unprecedented." Agent Santos nodded approvingly. "That's appropriate. If the documents are authentic, Mrs. Mitchell's financial situation will obviously change dramatically. Various institutions and collectors would be very interested in acquiring letters like these, whether through purchase or donation with tax benefits. Dr. Chen completed his initial examination as the sun began to set outside the study windows. His preliminary assessment was cautiously optimistic. The physical characteristics are consistent with authentic period documents. The paper, ink, and aging patterns all appear genuine, but definitive authentication will require laboratory analysis that I can't perform here. Sarah watched as the federal agents and historians carefully packed the letters in specialized containers, designed to preserve historical documents during transport. Everything was photographed and documented with a thoroughness that reminded her of military inventory procedures. Within hours, letters that had been hidden in her walls for decades would be in high-security federal facilities being analyzed by the country's top experts. "Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Rodriguez said as the team prepared to leave, "I want you to understand how extraordinary this discovery is. If authenticated, these letters could provide scholars with new insights into the founding of our nation. Your family has preserved a piece of American history that the entire country will benefit from." Detective Hayes provided Sarah with contact information for everyone involved in the investigation and authentication process. "You should hear preliminary results within a few weeks," he explained. "In the meantime, I recommend consulting with an attorney who specializes in cultural property law. The FBI can provide referrals to qualified professionals." As the convoy of official vehicles departed her driveway, Sarah stood alone in her suddenly quiet house, trying to process the day's events. The foreclosure notice still sat on her kitchen table, but it seemed like a relic from another lifetime. The house that had been hours away from bank seizure might now be saved by treasures hidden within its own walls. Jennifer was the last to leave, having spent the entire day far beyond her original assignment. "Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to know that Metropolitan Trust will work with you through whatever comes next. Today has been unlike anything in my professional experience." Sarah thanked Jennifer for her unexpected help and kindness, then walked through her house in the growing darkness. The hidden compartment behind David's bookshelf gaped open like a mouth that had finally spoken its secrets. She wondered what David would think about today's discovery, whether he had suspected the truth during his years of genealogy research. In the study, she found one of David's notebooks open to a page she hadn't noticed before. In his careful handwriting, he had written, "Jonas Mitchell, courier for General Washington. Family stories suggest he saved important documents from British capture. Hidden items in house construction. Investigate wall spaces behind built-in. A furniture." Sarah sank into David's desk chair, finally understanding that her husband had died, knowing exactly what was hidden in their home. He had spent his final years researching and planning, probably trying to determine the best way to reveal the family's secret. The cancer had claimed him before he could complete his investigation, leaving the discovery for Sarah to make at the moment when she needed it most. The irony wasn't lost on her that David's death had created the financial crisis that led to the foreclosure assessment that revealed the solution he had been working toward. Sometimes, she reflected, life operated according to a logic that was only visible in retrospect. As Sarah prepared for bed in her suddenly valuable house, she couldn't shake the feeling that today's discovery was only the beginning of a much larger story. If Jonas Mitchell had saved these particular letters, what other historical treasures might be hidden in homes across America waiting for the right moment to emerge and change everything. The next morning brought an unwelcome surprise that shattered Sarah's tentative optimism about her transformed circumstances. She woke to the sound of vehicles in her driveway and voices on her front porch. But when she peered through the bedroom curtains, she saw not the federal agents or historians she expected, but 3 men in expensive suits examining her property. With the calculating attention of appraisers or developers, Sarah dressed quickly and went downstairs to find one of the men photographing the exterior architectural details of her house, while another measured the front yard with a professional surveying device. The third man, distinguished-looking with silver hair and an air of casual authority, was speaking into a cell phone about property values and development potential. "Excuse me," Sarah called from her front porch. "Can I help you with something?" The silver-haired man ended his phone call and approached with a practiced smile that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of politicians she'd encountered during her military career. "Mrs. Mitchell, I presume? I'm Richard Hawthorne from Hawthorne Development Group. I understand you've recently come into some valuable assets, and I wanted to discuss a business proposition that could benefit us both." Sarah's military training had taught her to be suspicious of people who showed up uninvited with business propositions, especially when they somehow knew about private matters that hadn't been made public. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Mr. Hawthorne, and I'd appreciate it if you'd stop surveying my property without permission." Hawthorne's smile didn't waver, but something harder appeared behind his eyes. "Mrs. Mitchell, let's not play games. Word travels fast in certain circles when historical documents of significant value are discovered. I represent investors who are very interested in acquiring your recent find, and I'm prepared to make you an offer that would solve all your financial problems immediately." The fact that this stranger knew about yesterday's discovery sent alarm bells through Sarah's mind. The federal agents had emphasized the importance of keeping the find confidential during the authentication process, yet somehow private investors had already learned about it and were making unsolicited offers. "I think you should leave," Sarah said firmly, using the command voice she'd perfected during her army years. "I'm not interested in discussing anything with people who show up uninvited and seem to know information they shouldn't have access to." Hawthorne's expression shifted slightly, revealing calculation beneath the practiced charm. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand your caution, but you should be aware that authentication processes can be lengthy and expensive, with no guarantee of positive results. Meanwhile, you're facing immediate financial pressures that my clients could resolve today with a simple transaction." One of Hawthorne's associates approached and whispered something that made the developer's eyes narrow with interest. "Mrs. Mitchell, my colleague has been examining your property's survey records and building permits. It appears your house sits on land that's zoned for potential commercial development. With the right investors and the proper legal framework, this entire block could be transformed into something much more profitable than residential housing." The implicit threat was unmistakable. If Sarah didn't cooperate with their offer to purchase the documents, they had other ways to acquire her property. The coincidence of their appearance the day after her discovery seemed far too convenient to be accidental. "I think you need to leave now," Sarah repeated, pulling out her cell phone. "If you don't vacate my property immediately, I'm calling the police." Hawthorne raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender, but his smile had turned cold. "Of course, Mrs. Mitchell, we wouldn't want to overstay our welcome, but I hope you'll consider our conversation carefully." Opportunities like this don't come along often, and they don't remain available indefinitely. After the three men departed, Sarah immediately called Detective Hayes to report the incident. His reaction confirmed her suspicions that something wasn't right about Hawthorne's sudden appearance. "Mrs. Mitchell, the authentication process is supposed to be confidential until preliminary results are available," Hayes said, his voice tight with concern. "The fact that private investors already know about your discovery suggests there may be a leak in the system, or worse, some kind of surveillance or illegal information gathering." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "What does that mean for the safety of the documents? And for my safety, it means we need to increase security measures immediately," Hayes replied. "I'm going to contact Agent Santos and recommend that you be provided with protection until we understand how this information became public." Within 2 hours, Agent Santos arrived at Sarah's house with a partner, Agent Michael Torres, and an expression of barely controlled anger. "Mrs. Mitchell, we've traced the source of the information leak, and it's deeply troubling. Someone with access to federal law enforcement databases has been sharing confidential investigation details with outside parties." Sarah led the agents into her living room, noting how they automatically positioned themselves to observe both the interior of the house and the street outside. Their professional alertness made her realize that yesterday's discovery had placed her in a situation far more complex and dangerous than she'd initially understood. "The good news is that the documents are secure in federal facilities," Agent Torres explained. "The bad news is that certain private interests seem very motivated to acquire them, and they're not particularly concerned about legal methods." Agent Santos opened a laptop and showed Sarah photographs of Richard Hawthorne and his associates. Hawthorne Development Group is a front company for a network of investors who specialize in acquiring valuable cultural artifacts through questionable means. They've been involved in several cases where historical items mysteriously disappeared from private collections before they could be properly authenticated or donated to museums. Sarah studied the photographs, memorizing faces and trying to understand why anyone would go to such elaborate lengths to steal historical documents. "I don't understand the motivation. If the letters are authentic, wouldn't they be worth more when properly authenticated and sold through legitimate channels?" "Not necessarily," Agent Santos replied grimly. "Legitimate authentication and sale through museums or auction houses involves extensive documentation, provenance research, and often restrictions on future sale or display. Private collectors who operate outside legal frameworks are willing to pay premium prices for items with questionable ownership status." Agent Torres added disturbing context about the black market for historical artifacts. "There's an entire underground economy built around cultural objects that can't be displayed publicly or sold through legitimate channels. Some collectors prefer items that are essentially stolen because it guarantees exclusivity and eliminates the possibility of public exhibition." Sarah felt increasingly overwhelmed by the implications of her discovery. What had seemed like a miraculous solution to her financial problems was revealing itself as a complex web of federal investigations, private conspiracies, and potential criminal activity. "Mrs. Mitchell, we need to discuss security arrangements." "For your immediate safety," Agent Santos said seriously. "The people behind Hawthorne Development Group have been known to use intimidation tactics, property damage, and in some cases physical threats to pressure property owners into selling valuable items at below-market prices. The idea that she might be in physical danger because of letters hidden in her own walls seemed surreal, but Sarah's military experience had taught her to take security threats seriously. What kind of protection are we talking about? Agent Torres explained that the FBI could provide periodic surveillance and rapid response capabilities, but they couldn't station agents at her house around the clock unless there was evidence of imminent threats. The best protection is often a combination of federal oversight, local police cooperation, and your own awareness of potential dangers. Sarah realized she needed to understand more about what David's family had preserved and why it might be valuable enough to attract criminal attention. She retrieved David's genealogy research again, this time focusing specifically on Jonas Mitchell's role during the Revolutionary War. David's notes revealed details that took on new significance in light of recent events. Jonas Mitchell hadn't just been a simple courier. According to family records, he had been specifically tasked with preserving important documents when British forces threatened to capture or destroy American military and political communications. Agent Santos. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a section of David's research. According to family history, Jonas Mitchell was responsible for saving documents from destruction during British raids on American headquarters. If that's true, the letters in my wall might not be random correspondence. They might be specifically selected documents that someone thought were too important to risk losing. Agent Santos studied David's notes with growing interest. That would explain why private collectors are so interested. If these letters contain information that's not available in existing historical archives, they could provide insights into Revolutionary War strategy, early American politics, or founding fathers. Private thoughts that scholars have never seen. Agent Torres received a phone call that prompted him to step outside for privacy. When he returned, his expression was troubled. "Mrs. Mitchell, we've received intelligence that suggests the situation may be more complicated than we initially thought. There are indications that multiple groups are interested in your discovery, not just Hawthorne's organization." Sarah felt her anxiety increasing. What kind of other groups? Foreign collectors, academic institutions, and possibly government entities from other countries, Agent Santos explained. Original documents from America's founding period are considered extremely valuable by international collectors who specialize in democratic revolution artifacts. The scope of interest in her family's hidden treasure was becoming overwhelming. Sarah had expected that authentic George Washington letters would attract attention from American historians and museums, but the possibility of international intrigue seemed like something from a spy novel rather than her quiet suburban reality. Agent Torres's phone rang again, and this time his conversation was brief but obviously urgent. "Mrs. Mitchell, we've just received word that there was an attempted break-in at the federal facility where your documents are being stored. No one was injured and nothing was taken, but it confirms that multiple parties are actively trying to access these materials." Sarah sank into David's desk chair, feeling the weight of circumstances she couldn't control. "Agent Santos, I need to ask you directly, what have I gotten myself into? Yesterday I was facing foreclosure, and today I'm apparently in the middle of some kind of international conspiracy over historical documents." Agent Santos sat across from Sarah with the patient expression of someone accustomed to explaining complex situations to overwhelmed civilians. "Mrs. Mitchell, What you've discovered appears to be a collection of documents that multiple parties believe could be worth tens of millions of dollars. When that much money is involved, especially in the cultural artifacts market, things get complicated very quickly. But why is everyone so certain these documents are valuable before they've even been authenticated? Sarah asked. For all anyone knows, they could be elaborate forgeries or historical curiosities with limited commercial value. Agent Torres consulted his notes before answering. Our preliminary research suggests that collectors and institutions have been looking for exactly this type of material for decades. There are specific gaps in the historical record from the Revolutionary War period that scholars believe could be filled by missing correspondence between key figures. Sarah began to understand that her discovery had implications far beyond her personal financial situation. If the letters contained information that could change historical understanding of America's founding, they represented not just monetary value, but cultural and political significance that attracted interest from multiple sources. Mrs. Mitchell, Agent Santos said, "We need to discuss your options going forward. You can continue with the authentication process under federal protection, which could take months and involve considerable personal risk. Or you could consider immediate donation to a federal institution, which would provide security and tax benefits, but eliminate the possibility of private sale." Sarah realized she was facing a decision that would determine not just her financial future, but potentially her safety and peace of mind. The house that had been threatened by foreclosure 24 hours ago was now the center of a complex investigation involving federal agents, private conspiracies, and international interest. Outside, she noticed a dark sedan that had been parked across the street for the past hour, its occupants apparently conducting their own surveillance of her property. The quiet suburban neighborhood where she'd lived peacefully for decades had become a battleground over historical documents she'd never known existed. As afternoon shadows lengthened across David's study, Sarah understood that whatever decision she made about the letters would change her life irrevocably. The simple discovery of hidden documents had opened a door into a world of federal investigations, private conspiracies, and cultural politics that she was only beginning to comprehend. The solution to Sarah's isolation came from an unexpected source the following morning when Detective Hayes arrived with a woman Sarah immediately recognized as someone who understood the weight of service and sacrifice. Major Elena Vasquez, retired Army intelligence, carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades navigating complex situations where lives hung in the balance. "Mrs. Mitchell," Major Vasquez said, extending a firm handshake. "Detective Hayes reached out to me because of our shared military background and my experience with cultural property investigations. I understand you're facing some challenging circumstances." Sarah invited them into her living room, grateful to see someone who might understand the surreal nature of her situation from both military and civilian perspectives. Major Vasquez was perhaps 55, with graying hair pulled back in a practical style and eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of their surroundings automatically. Major Vasquez specializes in cases where historical artifacts intersect with national security concerns, Detective Hayes explained. She's worked with federal agencies on several high-profile cultural property cases, and she has clearance to access information that might help us understand what you're dealing with. Major Vasquez settled into David's reading chair with the easy authority of someone accustomed to taking charge of complicated situations. Mrs. Mitchell, I've reviewed the preliminary reports about your discovery, and I need to share some information that might help explain why so many different groups are interested in your family's documents. Sarah poured coffee for her visitors, noting how Major Vasquez automatically positioned herself to observe both the front door and the window facing the street where the surveillance sedan continued its patient watch. The presence of someone with military intelligence experience made Sarah feel more secure than she had since the discovery began. The letters you found aren't just historically significant, Major Vasquez continued. According to intelligence sources, collectors and foreign governments have been actively searching for this specific type of Revolutionary War correspondence for years. There are gaps in the documented communications between key founding fathers that several international entities believe could provide strategic insights into American political and military thinking. Detective Hayes added context that made Sarah's situation seem even more complex. What Major Vasquez is telling you is that your discovery has implications beyond American historical research. Some of the interested parties may be foreign intelligence services or government entities that collect information about American political development. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. Are you saying that foreign governments are interested in stealing letters from my wall because they think those letters contain information relevant to modern politics? Major Vasquez nodded grimly. Historical documents from America's founding period are considered extremely valuable by countries that want to understand how democratic institutions develop and function. The private thoughts and strategies of Washington, Hamilton, and Jefferson could provide insights that are still relevant to contemporary political analysis. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Through the window, Sarah could see Jennifer Walsh from Metropolitan Trust, but she wasn't alone. With her was an older woman in professional attire who carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to corporate boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations. Sarah opened the door cautiously, noting how Major Vasquez had automatically moved to a position where she could observe the newcomers while maintaining access to multiple exit routes. "Mrs. Mitchell," Jennifer said, "I'd like you to meet Margaret Chen, Senior Vice President for Cultural Assets at Metropolitan Trust. Ms. Chen specializes in situations where historical discoveries affect property values and ownership issues." Ms. Chen was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the kind of expensive clothing that suggested significant personal wealth. She examined Sarah's house with the appraising eye of someone who regularly dealt with valuable properties and their contents. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand you're facing some complex decisions regarding recently discovered historical materials," Miss Chen said, her voice carrying the smooth confidence of practiced negotiation. "Metropolitan Trust has extensive experience managing valuable cultural assets, and we're prepared to offer services that could protect both your interests and the historical significance of your discovery." Major Vasquez introduced herself with the crisp professionalism of someone identifying potential allies or threats. "Ms. Chen, I'm curious about Metropolitan Trust's involvement in cultural property management. That's not typically within a bank's area of expertise." Miss Chen's smile was polished, but revealed nothing about her thoughts. "Major Vasquez, Metropolitan Trust has expanded our services to include comprehensive asset management for clients who possess valuable cultural items. We work with authentication experts, security specialists, and legal professionals to ensure proper handling of significant discoveries. Sarah sensed undercurrents in the conversation that she didn't fully understand, but Major Vasquez's body language suggested increased alertness. Ms. Chen, could you explain how Metropolitan Trust learned about Mrs. Mitchell's discovery? The authentication process is supposed to be confidential during preliminary investigation phases. The question hung in the air with uncomfortable weight. Ms. Chen's composed expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed a slight pause before she responded. We became aware through our normal property assessment procedures. When valuable items are discovered during foreclosure processes, banks have obligations to ensure proper evaluation and protection. Detective Hayes spoke up with the measured tone of someone asking official questions. Ms. Chen, has Metropolitan Trust been contacted by any outside parties regarding Mrs. Mitchell's discovery? We're investigating how confidential information may have been compromised. Ms. Chen's answer was carefully worded. We've received inquiries from various parties interested in cultural property investments, but Metropolitan Trust maintains strict confidentiality protocols regarding client information. Major Vasquez exchanged a meaningful look with Detective Hayes that suggested they were both thinking the same thing. Sarah realized she was witnessing a professional assessment of whether Ms. Chen and Metropolitan Trust could be trusted with sensitive information. Mrs. Mitchell, Ms. Chen continued, I want to emphasize that Metropolitan Trust's primary concern is protecting your interests and ensuring that any valuable discoveries are properly managed. We're prepared to provide security, legal, and financial services that would allow you to maintain control over your family's historical materials while maximizing their potential value. Jennifer looked uncomfortable with the tension developing in the conversation. Mrs. Mitchell, I want to clarify that my original assessment and subsequent involvement have been completely professional. I had no idea that discovering those documents would lead to such complicated circumstances. Major Vasquez addressed Jennifer directly. Miss Walsh, we understand that your role has been legitimate. Our concerns focus on how information about this discovery spread beyond the immediate investigation team so quickly. The conversation was interrupted by Major Vasquez's phone, which she answered with military brevity. Her end of the conversation consisted mostly of, yes, understood, and will implement immediately. When she ended the call, her expression was more serious than before. Mrs. Mitchell, I've just received word that federal authorities want to upgrade security arrangements around your case. There's been intelligence suggesting that multiple hostile parties are planning coordinated efforts to acquire your documents. Ms. Chen's composed demeanor shifted slightly. Major Vasquez, when you say hostile parties, are you referring to criminal organizations or something more serious? I'm referring to entities that may not be bound by American law or legal processes, Major Vasquez replied carefully. The kind of parties that prefer acquisition methods that don't involve courts, negotiations, or authentication procedures. Sarah felt her world tilting again as she realized that her quiet suburban life had become the center of what sounded like an international incident. Major Vasquez, are you telling me that foreign agents or criminals might try to steal documents from my house? I'm telling you that historical artifacts worth tens of millions of dollars tend to attract attention from people who don't always operate within legal frameworks, Major Vasquez said bluntly. Your safety and the security of these documents require professional protection until the authentication process is complete. Detective Hayes received his own phone call, which prompted him to step outside for privacy. When he returned, he brought information that cast Ms. Chen's visit in a new light. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've just learned that Metropolitan Trust has been contacted by the same investment group that sent Richard Hawthorne to your house yesterday. Miss Chen, I think we need to discuss your bank's relationship with Hawthorne Development Group." Ms. Chen's professional composure cracked slightly. "Detective Hayes, I can assure you that any contacts between Metropolitan Trust and outside investment groups are handled through proper legal channels with full disclosure to relevant authorities." Major Vasquez stood up with the fluid motion of someone prepared for immediate action. "Miss Chen, I think this conversation needs to continue at police headquarters with appropriate legal representation for all parties. Mrs. Mitchell's situation has become a federal investigation, and all communications need to be properly documented." Sarah watched the rapid escalation of her situation with growing alarm. What had started as a property assessment had become a federal investigation involving multiple agencies, private corporations, and potentially foreign entities. The letters hidden in her walls had transformed her from a financially struggling widow into the center of what appeared to be an international conspiracy. Jennifer gathered her assessment materials with obvious anxiety. "Mrs. Mitchell, I want to apologize for any complications my involvement may have caused. I was trying to do my job professionally, and I had no idea it would lead to such complex circumstances." Ms. Chen maintained her professional demeanor, but Sarah could see calculation behind her eyes. "Mrs. Mitchell, I hope you'll consider Metropolitan Trust's offer to provide comprehensive asset management services. Historical discoveries of this magnitude require professional handling that protects both your interests and the cultural significance of the materials." After Miss Chen and Jennifer departed, Major Vasquez closed all the curtains and conducted a thorough security assessment of Sarah's house. She checked window locks, examined sight lines from the street, and identified potential vulnerabilities that concerned her. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to be direct with you about the security situation," Major Vasquez said, completing her inspection. "Your house is difficult to defend against determined intruders, and your neighborhood doesn't provide natural barriers to surveillance or approach. If hostile parties decide to take direct action, this location presents significant challenges." Sarah realized that staying in her family home might no longer be safe. "Major Vasquez, are you suggesting I should leave my house?" "I'm suggesting we need to discuss temporary relocation until the federal investigation reaches preliminary conclusions," Major Vasquez replied. "The FBI has safe house facilities designed for exactly these circumstances, and they can provide security that isn't possible in a residential neighborhood." Detective Hayes supported Major Vasquez's recommendation. "Mrs. Mitchell, we've identified at least 3 different groups conducting surveillance of your property. Staying here much longer could put you at unnecessary risk." Sarah looked around the living room where she'd spent 43 years building a life with David, hosting family gatherings and creating memories that defined her identity. The idea of leaving felt like abandoning everything that connected her to her husband and their shared history. "I understand the security concerns," Sarah said slowly, "but this house isn't just property to me. It's where David and I built our life together, where we raised our daughter, where his family preserved these historical documents for over a century, Leaving feels like betraying all of that. Major Vasquez sat down across from Sarah with the patient expression of someone who had counseled many people through difficult decisions. Mrs. Mitchell, I understand the emotional attachment to your home, but David preserved those documents so they could eventually serve a larger purpose. Protecting them and yourself serves that purpose better than staying in an unsecured location. Detective Hayes added practical considerations. Mrs. Mitchell, if something happens to you here, it compromises the entire investigation and potentially puts the documents themselves at risk. Temporary relocation protects both you and the historical materials. Your family has safeguarded. Sarah realized that her decision about leaving the house was really a decision about how to honor David's legacy and protect what Jonas Mitchell had preserved during the Revolutionary War. The documents hidden in her walls represented more than just financial security. They represented her family's contribution to American history. Major Vasquez, Sarah said finally, if I agree to temporary relocation, what guarantees do I have that I'll be able to return to my house and that my property rights will be protected? Major Vasquez's answer was honest and reassuring. Mrs. Mitchell, federal protection programs are designed specifically to preserve civilian rights while ensuring safety during investigations. You maintain all property ownership and decision-making. Authority. Relocation is temporary and voluntary, designed to protect you until threats are resolved. As Sarah prepared to make the most difficult decision of her life since David's death, she understood that choosing safety meant trusting strangers with her future while leaving behind everything familiar and comforting about her current existence. Sarah's decision to accept federal protection came with immediate consequences that underscored the seriousness of her situation. Within 3 hours of agreeing to temporary relocation, her quiet Victorian home had become the center of a carefully orchestrated operation that reminded her of military deployments she'd witnessed during her army career. Agent Santos arrived with a team of federal marshals and FBI technicians who efficiently swept the house for electronic surveillance devices while documenting everything that might be relevant to the ongoing investigation. Their discovery of 3 separate listening devices hidden in Sarah's living room, kitchen, and David's study confirmed that hostile parties had been monitoring her conversations for an unknown period. Mrs. Mitchell, these devices are sophisticated and recently installed, Agent Santos explained, showing Sarah a listening device no larger than a coin that had been concealed behind her television. Someone has been conducting professional surveillance of your home, probably since shortly after your discovery was reported through official channels. The revelation that strangers had been listening to her private conversations in her own home violated Sarah's sense of security in ways that abstract threats couldn't match. Every phone call, every conversation with federal agents, every moment of private grief or confusion had potentially been monitored by people whose intentions remained unknown. Agent Torres coordinated with local police to establish a secure perimeter around the house, while Sarah packed essential belongings under the guidance of federal marshals trained in protective relocation procedures. They emphasized the importance of maintaining normal routines and appearances to avoid alerting surveillance teams that security arrangements were changing. Mrs. Mitchell, we need you to pack as if you're going on a short vacation, Marshal Patricia Wells explained. Casual clothing, personal items, anything that would seem normal for a brief trip. We'll arrange for additional belongings to be retrieved, later if necessary. As Sarah gathered toiletries and clothing from her bedroom, she found herself looking at familiar objects with new understanding. The framed photograph of David in his army dress uniform on her nightstand represented not just personal memory, but a tradition of service that had led to this moment. The jewelry box containing her grandmother's wedding ring symbolized family heritage that now included Revolutionary War documents of national significance. Marshall Wells helped Sarah pack David's genealogy research, understanding that the family history documentation might be crucial for ongoing authentication and investigation processes. Mrs. Mitchell, this research could provide important context for understanding how the documents were preserved and why they're significant. The packing process was interrupted by Agent Santos, who had been monitoring communications between various federal agencies involved in the investigation. Mrs. Mitchell, I need to inform you that the authentication process has revealed preliminary information that confirms your documents are likely genuine. Dr. Chen from the Smithsonian has identified handwriting and paper characteristics consistent with verified Washington correspondence. Sarah felt simultaneous relief and anxiety at this news. Authentication meant her financial problems would be resolved, but it also meant that criminal interest in stealing the documents was based on accurate assessment of their value rather than hopeful speculation. Agent Santos, what does preliminary authentication mean for my safety and for the ongoing investigation? Sarah asked while folding clothes into her travel bag. It means that hostile parties were correct in assuming your documents are valuable, which increases their motivation to acquire them through illegal means, Agent Santos replied honestly. But it also means that federal authorities now have justification for enhanced protective measures and investigative resources. Marshall Wells received a secure communication that prompted her to accelerate the packing process. Mrs. Mitchell, we need to depart within the next 20 minutes. Intelligence sources have identified increased activity among known hostile parties, suggesting they may be planning immediate action. Sarah took a final walk through her house, saying goodbye to rooms that held decades of memories while uncertain when she might return. In David's study, she paused at the opened wall cavity where the documents had been hidden, wondering what other secrets the old house might contain and whether she would have the opportunity to explore them. The departure from her house was coordinated with military precision. Federal marshals positioned themselves at strategic points around the neighborhood, while Agent Santos escorted Sarah to an unmarked vehicle with bulletproof glass and enhanced security features. The entire operation took less than 5 minutes, during which Sarah saw neighbors watching from their windows with obvious curiosity about the sudden federal presence. Mrs. Mitchell, our destination is a secure facility about 90 minutes. From here, Marshall Wells explained as they drove through suburban streets toward the interstate. It's designed specifically for witness protection and cultural property cases where civilian safety intersects with national security concerns. During the drive, Agent Santos briefed Sarah about the federal safe house facility and the protocols that would govern her temporary residence. The facility houses about a dozen people at any given time, mostly witnesses in federal cases or individuals whose safety is compromised by criminal investigations. You'll have private quarters, access to communication with approved contacts, and security that allows you to focus on the authentication process without constant concern about personal safety. Sarah watched familiar landmarks disappear behind them as they traveled toward an uncertain future. The suburbs of her longtime residence gave way to rural farmland and eventually to forested hills where the safe house facility was located. The landscape reminded her of military bases she'd visited during her army career, isolated and self-contained, with security that was evident but not oppressive. The safe house itself was a converted conference center surrounded by wooded hills and accessible only through a single gated road monitored by federal security personnel. The main building looked like an upscale corporate retreat, with comfortable accommodations and meeting facilities designed to house people for extended periods while maintaining their ability to conduct business and maintain outside contacts. "Mrs. Mitchell, welcome to Fairfield House," said Director James Morrison, a calm man in his 50s who managed the facility with the efficiency of someone experienced in balancing security requirements with civilian comfort. "We'll do everything possible to make your stay here productive and as comfortable as circumstances allow." Sarah's quarters consisted of a suite with bedroom, sitting area, and office space, equipped with secure communication equipment that would allow her to participate in the authentication process remotely. The accommodations were comfortable, but clearly institutional, designed for people whose normal lives had been disrupted by extraordinary circumstances. During her first evening at the facility, Sarah met other residents whose stories illuminated the complex world she had inadvertently entered. Dr. Marcus Webb was an art historian who had discovered forgeries in a major museum's collection and was under protection while testifying in a federal art fraud case. Maria Santos, a former employee of an international antiquities dealer, was providing evidence about illegal trafficking of cultural artifacts stolen from developing countries. "Mrs. Mitchell, you'll find that everyone here has stumbled into situations they never expected," Dr. Webb explained during dinner in the facility's common dining room. "Cultural property crimes attract some of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in the world because the profit margins are enormous and the legal penalties are often minimal." Maria Santos added perspective about the international scope of cultural property crime. "The people interested in your documents probably operate in multiple countries and have resources that rival government agencies. They're not just criminals. They're entrepreneurs who treat historical artifacts like commodities to be bought and sold, regardless of their cultural significance." Sarah began to understand that her discovery had connected her to a global network of crime and legitimate scholarship that operated parallel to normal civilian life. The Revolutionary War letters hidden in her wall represented just one example of how historical artifacts moved through legal and illegal channels between private collectors, legitimate institutions, and criminal organizations. Director Morrison provided Sarah with secure communication access to participate in ongoing authentication discussions with Dr. Chen from the Smithsonian and other experts involved in analyzing her family's documents. The remote participation felt surreal, discussing 18th century letters from a 21st century safe house while federal agents monitored for security threats. "Mrs. Mitchell, the preliminary analysis has revealed aspects of your documents that we didn't anticipate," Dr. Chen explained during a secure video conference. Several of the letters contain references to political strategies and military decisions that aren't documented in existing historical archives. If authenticated, they could provide new insights into how the Founding Fathers approached some of the most crucial decisions in American history. The historical significance of her discovery was becoming clearer, but so was the complexity of determining what to do with documents that belonged to her family, but had implications for national and international understanding of American history. Dr. Chen explained that authentication would require several more weeks of laboratory analysis, during which time Sarah would need to make decisions about eventual disposition of the letters. Mrs. Mitchell, you have several options for how to handle authenticated documents, Dr. Chen continued. You could sell them through legitimate auction houses, donate them to museums or archives for tax benefits, or arrange for long-term loans that would provide income while ensuring public access and scholarly research. Agent Santos joined the video conference to provide updates about the ongoing investigation into criminal interest in Sarah's documents. Mrs. Mitchell, we've identified at least 5 separate organizations that have been gathering intelligence about your discovery. Some appear to be legitimate collectors or academic institutions, but others are clearly criminal enterprises that specialize in acquiring valuable cultural items through illegal means. The scope of interest in her family's preserved letters was both flattering and frightening. Sarah realized that Jonas Mitchell's decision to hide documents during the Revolutionary War had created consequences that extended far beyond anything he could have anticipated. The letters meant to preserve American history had become the center of contemporary international intrigue. During her second day at the safe house, Sarah received an unexpected visitor who would change her understanding of why so many different groups were interested in her family's documents. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a specialist in Revolutionary War political history from Georgetown University, had been granted security clearance to discuss specific aspects of what the hidden letters might contain. Mrs. Mitchell, I've reviewed preliminary photographs of your documents, and I believe they may contain information that several foreign governments have been seeking for decades, Dr. Hartwell explained. Some of the correspondence appears to discuss early American intelligence operations and political strategies that influenced how democratic institutions developed in other countries. Sarah began to understand that the letters hidden in her wall weren't just valuable as historical curiosities or collectible artifacts. They potentially contained information that contemporary governments considered relevant to understanding American political and military thinking during the nation's formative period. Dr. Hartwell, are you suggesting that modern governments are interested in 18th century letters because they think those letters contain information relevant to current politics? Sarah asked. I'm suggesting that the Founding Fathers' private discussions about democracy, military strategy, and international relations are still studied by foreign intelligence services as examples of American political thinking, Dr. Hartwell replied. Your documents might provide insights into how American leaders approach long-term strategic planning and democratic governance. The conversation was interrupted by Director Morrison, who brought news that would escalate Sarah's situation to levels she couldn't have imagined. Mrs. Mitchell, I've just received word that the White House has been briefed about your discovery. The National Security Council is convening a meeting to discuss the implications of your documents for contemporary diplomatic and security concerns. Sarah stared at Director Morrison, trying to process the information that her hidden family letters had somehow become a matter of national security, requiring presidential attention. The foreclosure notice that had seemed like the end of her world just days ago now seemed insignificant compared to the reality that the President of the United States was being briefed about documents found in her living room wall. Director Morrison, what does White House involvement mean for my situation and for the documents? Sarah asked, feeling completely overwhelmed by the escalating scope of her circumstances. Mrs. Mitchell, it means that your discovery has implications that extend far beyond historical scholarship or personal financial benefit, Director Morrison replied seriously. When original Founding Fathers correspondence contains information that contemporary governments consider strategically significant, it becomes a matter of national security that requires the highest levels of government attention. As Sarah prepared for bed in her safe house quarters, she reflected on how completely her life had changed since Jennifer Walsh's routine foreclosure assessment had revealed the hidden wall cavity. She had gone from facing homelessness to being under federal protection, while the President of the United States received briefings about letters her husband's ancestor had preserved during the Revolutionary War. The quiet suburban widow who had struggled to pay medical bills was now at the center of an international incident involving foreign intelligence services, criminal organizations, and the highest levels of American government. The transformation felt so complete that Sarah sometimes wondered if she was living through an elaborate dream rather than an impossible reality. The call that would change everything came at 6:30 the following morning, waking Sarah from restless sleep in her safe house quarters. Director Morrison's voice carried an urgency she hadn't heard before as he requested her immediate presence in the facility's secure conference room for what he described only as developments requiring urgent discussion. Sarah dressed quickly and found the conference room occupied by more federal officials than she had seen assembled in one place since her arrival. Agent Santos and Agent Torres were present, along with Major Vasquez, but they were joined by 3 new faces whose bearing and expensive suits suggested much higher levels of government authority. "Mrs. Mitchell, please sit down," Director Morrison said, gesturing to a chair at the head of the polished conference table. "I need to introduce you to some people who have been following your case at the highest levels of government." The eldest of the newcomers, a distinguished man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to briefing presidents, identified himself as Deputy National Security Advisor Robert Harrison. Beside him sat Dr. Catherine Wells from the State Department's Office of Cultural Property Protection and Colonel Michael Torres from the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency. "Mrs. Mitchell, we're here because your family's documents have revealed information that affects current American national security interests," Deputy Harrison began, without preamble. "The authentication process has uncovered correspondence that discusses early American intelligence operations, military strategies, and diplomatic relationships that remain classified at the highest levels of government." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized the implications of what she was hearing. "Are you telling me that letters written in the 1700s contain information that's still classified by the modern American government?" Dr. Wells leaned forward with the patient expression of someone explaining complex policy to civilians. "Mrs. Mitchell, What we're telling you is that some of the strategic thinking and operational methods discussed in your documents established patterns that American intelligence and military services still use today, revealing certain details. Good compromise contemporary operations. Colonel Torres added military perspective that made Sarah's situation seem even more serious. The Founding Fathers developed intelligence networks, communication codes, and strategic deception methods that influenced how American military and intelligence services operate. Some of those methods are still in use, which means historical documents describing them could be valuable to hostile foreign governments. Sarah struggled to comprehend how Revolutionary War letters could threaten modern national security. I don't understand how 18th century military strategies could be relevant to contemporary intelligence operations. Deputy Harrison opened a classified briefing folder and showed Sarah excerpts from her own family's documents that had been enlarged and enhanced for analysis. Mrs. Mitchell, look at this letter from George Washington to Alexander Hamilton. It describes a method for creating false intelligence networks designed to confuse British forces about American military capabilities and intentions. Sarah realized she was facing a decision between immediate safety and prolonged uncertainty. Transferring to military protection would ensure her physical security, but might also mean spending an indefinite period isolated from her normal life. While government agencies work to resolve complex international security concerns, Deputy Harrison, if I agree to transfer to Joint Base Andrews, will I be able to have visitors or maintain contact with family and friends? Sarah asked, thinking about her daughter Katie in Seattle, who didn't even know about the document discovery yet. Mrs. Mitchell, you'll have access to secure communication with approved contacts, and we can arrange for family visits under appropriate security protocols, Deputy Harrison assured her. The goal is to protect you while maintaining as much normalcy as possible under extraordinary circumstances. Agent Santos received a secure communication that prompted urgent consultation with Deputy Harrison and Colonel Torres. Their brief conversation resulted in a decision that eliminated Sarah's time for further consideration. Mrs. Mitchell, we need to implement transfer to Joint Base Andrews immediately, Deputy Harrison announced. Intelligence sources have identified increased hostile activity that requires enhanced protective measures. Sarah found herself packing her belongings again, this time for transfer to a military installation where she would be protected as a high-value intelligence asset rather than simply a civilian witness. The transformation from foreclosure-threatened widow to national security concern was complete, and there was no possibility of returning to her former life until the complex web of authentication, investigation, and international intrigue was resolved. As federal marshals prepared her for secure transport to Joint Base Andrews, Sarah reflected on how Jonas Mitchell's decision to preserve Revolutionary War documents had created consequences that extended across centuries to involve contemporary foreign intelligence operations and presidential attention. The letters hidden in her wall had connected her family's history to the ongoing story of American national security in ways that neither Jonas nor David could possibly have anticipated. The helicopter that would transport her to military protection waited on the safe-house landing pad, its rotors already spinning in preparation for immediate departure. The helicopter flight to Joint Base Andrews gave Sarah her first glimpse of the true scope of government resources focused on her situation. The aircraft was a military transport, with sophisticated communication equipment and security features that made civilian helicopters seem like toys by comparison. Through the windows, she could see escort vehicles following their flight path on highways below, while additional aircraft maintained protective formations at discrete distances. Colonel Torres accompanied Sarah during the flight, using the time to brief her about the enhanced security protocols that would govern her residence at the military facility. Mrs. Mitchell, Joint Base Andrews, houses some of the most sensitive government operations in the country. Your presence there reflects the highest level of federal protection available to civilians. As they approached the base, Sarah could see the massive installation stretching across thousands of acres with multiple runways, aircraft hangars, and secure facilities designed to support everything from presidential transport to classified military operations. The scale of the installation emphasized how completely her circumstances had changed, from suburban civilian life to military protection. The helicopter landed at a secure facility within the base that Sarah learned was designated for high-value intelligence assets and witnesses in cases involving foreign espionage. The building looked like an upscale hotel from the outside, but the security measures were obviously military: armed guards, electronic surveillance, and access controls that required multiple forms of identification. Mrs. Mitchell, welcome to Facility 7, said Lieutenant Colonel Sandra Hayes, the commanding officer responsible for civilian protection operations. We've prepared accommodations that will allow you to work on authentication matters while ensuring your complete safety from any external threats. Sarah's new quarters were significantly more comfortable than the previous safe house, with a suite that included bedroom, office, sitting area, and access to recreational facilities designed for long-term residents. The accommodations reflected the reality that her stay might extend for months rather than weeks, depending on how quickly authentication and security concerns could be resolved. During her first briefing at the military facility, Sarah met Dr. James Patterson from the National Security Agency, whose expertise in historical intelligence methods would prove crucial to understanding why her documents had attracted international attention. Dr. Patterson was perhaps 45, with the intellectual bearing of someone who spent his career analyzing how historical information affected contemporary security concerns. Mrs. Mitchell, I've been studying your family's documents in the context of ongoing intelligence operations, and I need to explain why foreign governments consider them strategically valuable, Dr. Patterson began. The letters contain detailed descriptions of intelligence networks, communication methods, and strategic deception techniques that establish patterns still used by American intelligence services. Dr. Patterson showed Sarah classified analyses of her documents that revealed layers of meaning she hadn't understood. Look at this correspondence between Washington and Benjamin Franklin about using civilian merchants as intelligence assets. The network they describe became the foundation for how American intelligence services still recruit and manage civilian sources in foreign countries. Sarah studied the analysis, beginning to understand how 18th century intelligence methods had evolved into contemporary operational procedures. Dr. Patterson, are you saying that methods described in these letters are still classified because they're still being used? I'm saying that the strategic thinking and operational principles described in your documents established American intelligence doctrines that remain relevant to current operations, Dr. Patterson replied. Foreign intelligence services have been trying to understand these doctrines for decades, and your letters provide detailed explanations of how they originated. The briefing was interrupted by Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who brought news that would escalate Sarah's situation to levels requiring presidential decision-making. Mrs. Mitchell, I've just received word that foreign intelligence assets have been identified attempting to penetrate base security. The threat to your safety has reached levels that require National Security Council attention. Sarah felt her world spin as she realized that foreign agents were attempting to breach a United States military installation to acquire access to her or information about her family's documents. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, are you telling me that foreign governments are willing to attack an American military base to steal Revolutionary War letters? I'm telling you that the strategic information contained in your documents is considered valuable enough by certain foreign governments to justify sophisticated intelligence operations against American installations, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes replied grimly. Dr. Patterson added context that made the international interest seem even more serious. Mrs. Mitchell, several foreign governments have been developing capabilities to counter American intelligence operations for decades. Your documents provide detailed explanations of American intelligence methods that could help hostile nations develop more effective countermeasures. Agent Santos arrived at the base with updates about the criminal investigation that had evolved into a counterintelligence operation. Mrs. Mitchell, we've identified specific foreign intelligence officers who have been coordinating with criminal organizations to acquire your documents. This has become an active espionage case involving multiple hostile nations. Sarah struggled to comprehend how her family's preserved letters had become the center of contemporary international espionage. Agent Santos, what countries are we talking about, and what are they willing to do to acquire these documents? Agent Santos consulted classified briefing materials before answering. Mrs. Mitchell, I can tell you that at least 3 foreign intelligence services have been identified as actively pursuing your documents. Their methods have included surveillance, attempted bribery, coordination with criminal organizations, and now apparently attempts to penetrate American military installations. The scope of international interest in her discovery was both flattering and terrifying. Sarah realized that Jonas Mitchell's decision to preserve Revolutionary War documents had created consequences that extended far beyond anything an 18th-century courier could have anticipated. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes received a secure communication that prompted immediate consultation with Dr. Patterson and Agent Santos. Their urgent conversation resulted in a decision that would bring Sarah's situation to the attention of the highest levels of American government. Mrs. Mitchell, the National Security Council is convening an emergency session to discuss your case, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes announced. The President has been briefed about the foreign intelligence operations targeting your documents, and he wants to personally review options for resolving this situation. Sarah stared at Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, trying to process information that seemed completely surreal. Are you telling me that the President of the United States is personally involved in decisions about letters found in my living room wall? I'm telling you that your documents contain information that affects American national security interests at the highest levels, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes replied. When foreign intelligence services attempt to penetrate American military installations to acquire historical documents, it becomes a matter requiring presidential attention. Dr. Patterson provided additional context about why presidential involvement was necessary. Mrs. Mitchell, the strategic information in your documents could compromise American intelligence operations in multiple countries if it fell into hostile hands. Protecting that information requires decisions that can only be made at the presidential level. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Deputy National Security Advisor Harrison, who had flown to Joint Base Andrews for an urgent briefing about developments in Sarah's case. His presence at the military facility emphasized the gravity of the situation and the level of government resources focused on protecting her and her family's documents. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm here because the President wants to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with before making decisions about how to proceed, Deputy Harrison explained. Your situation has evolved from cultural property protection to active counterintelligence operations involving multiple foreign governments. Sarah felt completely overwhelmed by the escalating attention her discovery was receiving. Deputy Harrison, I need to understand what the President's involvement means for my situation and for my family's documents. Deputy Harrison's answer was measured but serious. Mrs. Mitchell, presidential involvement means that your case has been classified at the highest levels of national security. Any decisions about authentication, disposition, or protection of your documents will be made with consideration of their impact on American intelligence capabilities and international security concerns. Dr. Patterson showed Sarah additional classified analysis that revealed the full scope of international interest in her family's documents. Mrs. Mitchell, intelligence sources have identified at least 6 foreign governments that have expressed interest in acquiring your documents through various means. Some of these governments are allies, but others are hostile nations that would use the information to develop capabilities against American interests. Agent Santos provided updates about the ongoing counterintelligence investigation that had replaced the original criminal case. Mrs. Mitchell, we've identified foreign intelligence networks that have been preparing for months to acquire documents exactly like yours. The sophistication of their operations suggests they had advanced knowledge that historically significant materials might be discovered. Sarah began to suspect that foreign intelligence services might have known about her family's hidden documents before she discovered them herself. Agent Santos, are you suggesting that foreign governments knew about the letters in my wall before I found them? I'm suggesting that certain foreign intelligence services have been conducting research into American historical documents that might contain strategically valuable information. Agent Santos replied carefully. Your family's name and property might have been identified as a potential source of such materials. The revelation that foreign agents might have been monitoring her family for years before the documents were discovered made Sarah feel violated in ways that transcended concerns about personal safety. The idea that her husband David's genealogy research might have attracted hostile attention during his lifetime was deeply disturbing. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes received another secure communication that brought news requiring immediate presidential briefing. Mrs. Mitchell, intelligence sources have identified foreign intelligence operations in at least 4 other locations where similar historical documents might be hidden. Your discovery appears to be part of a larger pattern of foreign interest in American Revolutionary War materials. Deputy Harrison made a decision that would bring Sarah into direct contact with the highest levels of American government. Mrs. Mitchell, the President wants to meet with you personally to understand the situation from your perspective before making final decisions about how to proceed. You'll be transported to the White House for a classified briefing tomorrow morning. Sarah felt her knees weaken as she realized that her situation had escalated to levels requiring personal presidential attention. Deputy Harrison, what does a meeting with the President mean, and what kinds of decisions is he considering? The President needs to understand the full scope of what your family preserved and the implications of foreign intelligence interest in those materials, Deputy Harrison explained. His decisions could affect American intelligence operations, international diplomatic relationships, and the security of similar historical materials throughout the country. Dr. Patterson added perspective about the historical significance of presidential involvement in cultural property cases. Mrs. Mitchell, there are very few precedents for presidential attention to privately owned historical documents. Your situation represents a unique intersection of cultural heritage, national security, and international intelligence concerns. As Sarah prepared for what would be the most extraordinary day of her life, she reflected on the journey from foreclosure threatened widow to presidential briefing participant. The transformation seemed so complete that she sometimes wondered if she was living through an elaborate dream rather than impossible reality. Agent Santos provided final briefing about security protocols for presidential meetings. Mrs. Mitchell, tomorrow's meeting will involve the highest levels of government security. You'll be transported by military aircraft and will participate in discussions that affect American national security at the presidential level. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes ensured that Sarah understood the magnitude of what was happening. Mrs. Mitchell, very few civilians ever participate in presidential national security briefings. Your presence in those discussions reflects both the extraordinary nature of your discovery and the trust that the government places in your discretion and patriotism. Sarah realized that tomorrow would determine not just the fate of her family's documents, but potentially the course of American intelligence operations and international relationships. The letters hidden in her wall by Jonas Mitchell during the Revolutionary War had created consequences that would be resolved in the Oval Office with the President of the United States. The quiet suburban widow who had struggled to pay medical bills was about to advise the President about matters of national security that extended far beyond anything she could have imagined when Jennifer Walsh knocked on her door to conduct a routine foreclosure assessment. As Sarah tried to sleep in her quarters at Joint Base Andrews, she wondered what David would think about the extraordinary developments that had emerged from his family's preserved heritage. The genealogy research that had seemed like an elderly man's hobby had led to discoveries that required presidential attention and affected American national security. Tomorrow would bring her face to face with the President of the United States to discuss Revolutionary War letters that foreign governments considered worth stealing and American intelligence services needed to protect. The scope of consequences flowing from Jonas Mitchell's decision to hide documents during the nation's founding had finally reached the highest levels of contemporary American government. 6 months after her meeting with the President, Sarah Mitchell stood in the newly constructed Mitchell Research Center at George Washington University, watching as teams of scholars and government historians carefully examined her family's documents in a state-of-the-art facility designed specifically for the preservation and study of the Revolutionary War correspondence. The center bore her family's name not because of wealth or political influence, but because Jonas Mitchell's decision to preserve crucial historical documents had created one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in American history. The authentication process had confirmed what preliminary analysis had suggested. The documents were not only genuine revolutionary war correspondence, but represented the most complete collection of strategic communications between founding fathers ever discovered. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell from Georgetown University, now serving as the center's director, had established that the letters filled crucial gaps in historical understanding of how American democracy and intelligence capabilities had developed during the nation's founding period. Mrs. Mitchell, the impact of your family's documents extends far beyond anything we initially anticipated, Dr. Hartwell explained, as they toured the climate-controlled research facility where teams of international scholars worked under strict security protocols. These letters have already changed how historians understand Revolutionary War strategy, early American diplomacy, and the development of democratic institutions. Sarah's new life bore little resemblance to her former existence as a financially struggling widow facing foreclosure. The government protection program had provided her with comfortable housing in a secure residential community near Washington, D.C. Ongoing security that had become less obvious but remained comprehensive, and financial arrangements that ensured her complete security for the remainder of her life. The legal framework governing her documents had been carefully crafted to balance her ownership rights with national security concerns and historical significance. Sarah retained legal title to the letters while granting long-term research access to approved institutions under agreements that protected sensitive information while maximizing scholarly benefit. The financial arrangements included both direct compensation and tax advantages that had transformed her from near poverty to substantial wealth. Sarah, you should know that requests for research access to your documents come from universities and museums around the world, said Dr. Marcus Webb, the former art historian who had shared the previous safe house and now served as the center's coordinator for international scholarly exchange. Your family's preservation of these materials has created opportunities for historical research that scholars have dreamed about for centuries. The Mitchell Research Center had become a model for how culturally significant discoveries could be managed to serve both private ownership rights and public historical interests. Sarah's cooperation with government authorities had resulted in arrangements that protected national security while ensuring that her family's contribution to American heritage received appropriate recognition and compensation. Agent Santos, now promoted to head the FBI's expanded Cultural Property Protection Division, visited the center regularly to coordinate ongoing security measures and international cooperation agreements. Sarah, the foreign intelligence interest in your documents has evolved from active theft attempts to legitimate diplomatic requests for research access. Your decision to work with government authorities helped transform a security crisis into an opportunity for international scholarly cooperation. The transformation of criminal and espionage threats into legitimate academic interest had taken months of careful diplomacy and security arrangements. Several foreign governments that had initially attempted to acquire the documents through illegal means were now participating in authorized research programs that provided them access to non-sensitive information while protecting strategic details that remained classified. Sarah had found unexpected fulfillment in her new role as a bridge between her family's historical legacy and contemporary scholarly research. She regularly met with researchers, participated in authentication discussions, and helped coordinate access to documents while ensuring that Jonas Mitchell's memory and David's genealogical work received appropriate recognition. Mrs. Mitchell, your husband's research has proven invaluable for understanding the historical context of your family's documents, said Dr. Catherine Wells from the State Department's Office of Cultural Property Protection, who had become a close advisor during the complex process of establishing international research protocols. David's genealogical work provided the framework that allowed us to understand how these materials were preserved and why they remained hidden for so long. The center's research had revealed additional family history that explained how Jonas Mitchell had obtained the documents and why they had been hidden with such care. Military records showed that Jonas had served not just as a courier, but as part of an elite group responsible for preserving crucial documents when British forces threatened to capture or destroy American military and political communications. Sarah, your ancestor wasn't just a messenger, Dr. Hartwell explained, while showing Sarah newly discovered military records that had been declassified for the center's research. Jonas Mitchell was part of a coordinated effort to ensure that American strategic thinking and operational methods would survive even if the revolution failed. He was literally tasked with preserving the intellectual foundation of American democracy. Understanding Jonas Mitchell's true role in preserving the documents had given Sarah a deeper appreciation for her family's contribution to American history. The letters hadn't been randomly preserved. They had been specifically selected by people who understood their strategic and historical significance even during the chaos of revolutionary warfare. The center's work had also revealed information about David's final years that provided Sarah with closure about her husband's last project. David had indeed discovered clues about the hidden documents during his genealogy research, and his final months had been spent trying to determine the best way to reveal the family's secret without compromising its historical value or creating security concerns. Sarah, David left detailed notes about his intentions for the documents. Dr. Wells showed her research files that had been found in David's papers after the initial discovery. He understood that the materials had historical significance that extended beyond family heritage, and he was planning to contact appropriate authorities before his illness prevented him from completing the process. Knowing that David had died while working to honor the family's historical legacy provided Sarah with peace about his final project and confirmation that her decisions about the documents aligned with his intentions. The center's research had validated David's instincts about the significance of what Jonas Mitchell had preserved. Sarah's personal transformation had been as dramatic as her financial and security circumstances. The woman who had once struggled to pay medical bills now served on the boards of multiple historical organizations, consulted with government agencies about cultural property protection, and had become a recognized expert on the intersection of private ownership and public historical interest.